The ambient temperature on the 42nd floor of the Daniels & Company high-rise had been dropping steadily since 8 o'clock. The HVAC system, an outdated relic in an otherwise modernized glass tower, had catastrophically failed just as the winter front rolled off Lake Michigan. I sat at the far end of the mahogany boardroom table, my fingers resting motionless on the keys of my laptop. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sharp, erratic tapping of a stylus against a tablet. I didn't need to look up to know Amelia was spiraling. I could feel the frantic energy radiating from her side of the room, a desperate, exhausted vibration that clashed with my own compartmentalized stillness. I was a forensic accountant. My world was built on ledgers, routing numbers, and the cold, hard reality of mezzanine debt tranches. Chaos was just an equation waiting to be balanced. But watching the CEO of the firm slowly dismantle her own physical health to save a sinking ship was a variable I hadn't properly modeled. I shifted my gaze from the glowing spreadsheet on my primary monitor to the woman standing by the floor-to-ceiling window. Amelia Daniels was 38, brilliant, and currently carrying the weight of a $70 million hostile takeover on her shoulders. She was staring out at the frozen Chicago skyline, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso. She had abandoned her tailored blazer hours ago, leaving her in a thin silk blouse that offered zero protection against the failing climate control. I watched a visible tremor run through her shoulders. I closed my laptop lid. The quiet click echoed in the vast room. I stood up, retrieving my heavy wool suit jacket from the back of my leather chair. I walked the length of the boardroom, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and stopped 2 feet behind her. I didn't ask for permission, nor did I offer a platitude. I simply draped the heavy charcoal gray wool over her trembling shoulders. She flinched for a fraction of a second, a conditioned reflex of a woman used to fighting off threats, before the weight and warmth of the fabric settled over her. Her hands instantly came up, her fingers gripping the wide lapels and pulling the jacket tight across her collarbones. The tremor stopped. The sudden stillness that washed over her was profound, like a machine finally being allowed to power down. I stepped back, maintaining a precise, respectful distance. I slipped my hands into my trouser pockets, locking my fingers down to prevent the instinctual urge to smooth the tangled waves of blonde hair resting against the dark wool of my collar. The building manager said the primary heating coil won't be replaced until morning, I stated, keeping my voice low, flat, and entirely professional. Amelia didn't turn around immediately. She kept her gaze fixed on the amber grid of traffic far below, her grip on my lapels white-knuckled. "I can't leave, Daniel. Marcus has the board voting on the acquisition by Friday. If I don't find the structural flaw in his valuation model by tomorrow morning, this company is gone." "You won't find it tonight if you freeze to death or drop from exhaustion," I replied. I watched her shoulders rise and fall in a slow, deep breath. The scent of rain and my own mild cedar aftershave seemed to hang in the cold air between us. I asked my boss why she was wearing my jacket. She whispered, "Because it still smells like you." It was a micro hook of vulnerability, a sudden, staggering admission that my presence offered her something the rest of the world had stripped away. It was safety. It was an anchor. I didn't let the weight of her words shift my tactical focus. I couldn't afford to. Marcus Vance, the VP of Acquisitions, wasn't just attempting a buyout. He was executing a corporate execution. He had systematically devalued the company's core assets by leaking false risk assessments to our primary lenders, triggering a series of toxic debt covenants. It was an inside job, clean and brutally efficient. Amelia finally turned around to face me. The dark circles under her eyes were stark in the harsh fluorescent lighting. She looked small inside my oversized jacket, the sleeves hanging past her wrists, but the intelligence in her gaze was as sharp as ever. "Marcus filed the preliminary injunction at 5 p.m., she said, her voice regaining a fraction of its usual executive command. "He's claiming fiduciary negligence. He's going to use the Q3 losses to force a mandatory liquidation of my voting shares." "He's using a proxy," I said, stepping back toward the table and pulling out a thick, bound file I had retrieved from the archives 3 hours earlier. "The Q3 losses aren't operational. They're synthetic. I've been tracking the capital outflow from the logistics division. $7 million evaporated into a series of shell LLCs registered in Delaware." Amelia walked over, the hem of my jacket swishing against her slacks. She leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the complex routing numbers I had highlighted in stark yellow. "Can you prove he owns the LLCs?" "Not yet," I admitted, my tone clipped and precise. "The corporate veil is thick. He used a registered agent service to blind the ownership structure, but money leaves a gravitational pull. If I can match the deposit timestamps of the LLC accounts to the exact moments his personal equity portfolio spiked, I can establish a circumstantial pattern strong enough to file a counter-injunction for fraud." "How long will that take?" she asked, her voice tight with renewed panic. She reached for her tablet again, her thumb hovering over the screen. "I need to call legal." "We need to start drafting a defense strategy. If I pull the historical data from—" "Stop!" I said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. I reached out and gently closed the cover of her tablet, pressing my palm flat against the leather case. She froze, her eyes snapping up to meet mine. The dynamic between us was always heavily structured. She was the CEO, I was the hired gun, the forensic specialist brought in to clean up messes. But right now, she was a woman running on adrenaline and fumes, and I was the only wall standing between her and a total collapse. "You are not calling legal at midnight," I said, my voice steady, dropping the boardroom formality for a grounded, quiet authority. "You are running in circles. Panic is inefficient. I need you sharp tomorrow, not burned out tonight." "Daniel, I can't just rest. Marcus is actively—" "Marcus is sleeping," I interrupted cleanly, "because his trap is already set. We do not beat him by matching his chaos. We beat him by dismantling his structure piece by piece. And right now, the most critical piece of our infrastructure is your cognitive function." I pointed to the small leather sofa in the corner of the room. "Sit down. Drink the water on the side table. Do not look at a screen for the next 20 minutes. I will run the primary batch script on the timestamps. When it finishes compiling, I will brief you. Until then, you are off the clock." Amelia stared at me, her mouth slightly parted. For a long, tense moment, I thought she was going to override me, to pull rank and dive back into the frantic, useless cycle of checking the same ledgers over and over. But then, she exhaled. The fight drained out of her posture. She pulled my jacket tighter around herself, walked over to the sofa, and sat down. She drew her knees up slightly, leaning her head back against the wall. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer a frantic void. It was a guarded sanctuary. I turned back to my dual monitors, my jaw set. I was going to find the missing $7 million, and I was going to sever Marcus Vance's leverage cleanly and permanently. The process was grueling. Forensic accounting isn't about dramatic discoveries. It's about the microscopic alignment of mundane details. For the next 3 hours, the only sound in the freezing boardroom was the rapid clatter of my mechanical keyboard. I opened a secure terminal, running a complex query against the swift transaction logs I had legally subpoenaed through our internal audit protocols. I was looking for a specific numeric fingerprint, a staggered transfer sequence designed to avoid automated banking flags. At 2:14 a.m., my screen flashed with a syntax error. The query had failed. I rubbed the bridge of my nose, fighting the dull ache blooming behind my eyes. I was missing a variable. I pulled up the mezzanine debt contract, scrolling through 80 pages of dense legalese until I found the specific covenant Marcus had weaponized. Clause 4.2b. a standard material adverse change trigger. But there was a subclause, buried in a footnote, referencing a specific escrow account holding the Logistics Division's operational reserves. I cross-referenced the escrow account number with the Delaware LLC deposits. The numbers aligned perfectly. It wasn't a pattern. It was a direct pipeline. I exhaled a slow, steady breath. I had the murder weapon. Now, I just needed the fingerprints on the handle. I needed the authorization signature that released the escrow funds. I glanced over at the sofa. Amelia had fallen asleep. Her head was tilted to the side, her breathing slow and even. My jacket covered her entirely, a dark shield against the freezing room. I stood up quietly, my joints popping in the cold air. I walked over to the break room down the hall, my footsteps silent on the carpet. I found a heavy wool blanket in the emergency supply closet, likely left over from a previous winter storm. I carried it back into the boardroom. I stood over Amelia for a moment. Her face, usually set in a mask of corporate invulnerability, was soft, the lines of stress smoothed away by exhaustion. I carefully unfolded the blanket, draping it over my jacket, doubling the insulation. I didn't let my hands linger. I didn't brush the hair from her face. I maintained the boundary, showing my loyalty through logistics, not physical indulgence. I walked back to my workstation, my resolve hardening into something cold and absolute. I was going to break Marcus Vance. The sun was a pale, icy strip on the horizon when the boardroom doors slammed open. The sudden noise shattered the quiet sanctuary I had built. I stood up instantly, my body placing itself between the doorway and the sofa where Amelia was just beginning to stir. Marcus Vance stood in the threshold, flanked by 3 men in sharp, identical gray suits. They weren't building security. They carried heavy leather briefcases and an air of bureaucratic authority. "Good morning, Daniel," Marcus said, his voice dripping with forced corporate cheer. He was a man who wore his ambition like cheap cologne, overpowering and entirely unearned. "I see you and Amelia had a late night. Unfortunately, your access to the floor is now restricted." Amelia sat up, the blanket falling away as she gripped the lapels of my jacket. "Marcus," she said, her voice raspy from sleep but instantly finding its steel. "What is this?" "This," Marcus said, gesturing to the 3 men, "is an independent auditing firm hired by the board of directors. Following my preliminary injunction yesterday, the board held an emergency remote session at 6 a.m. Given the catastrophic discrepancies in the Q3 logistics reports, they have authorized an immediate, hard-stop audit of all executive communications and forensic data." He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "Step away from the computers, Daniel. You are locked out of the network as of 3 minutes ago." My mind raced, categorizing the threat, analyzing the variables. This was a classic containment play. Marcus knew I was digging, and he had used his board influence to artificially move the deadline, deploying external auditors to sever my access to the data before I could finish compiling the proof of his fraud. One of the gray-suited men stepped forward, pulling a formal document from his briefcase. "Mr. Gray, we require you to surrender your laptop and any physical files currently in your possession." I didn't move. I looked at the document in the auditor's hand, then looked at Marcus. "Under what specific authority?" I asked, my voice calm, stripping the emotion from the room and replacing it with pure, procedural logic. "Under the authority of the board majority," Marcus snapped, losing a fraction of his smug composure. "Read the mandate." I didn't take the paper. I clasped my hands behind my back. "A board majority can authorize an external audit," I stated, my tone resembling a professor correcting a slow student. "However, under the Sarbanes-Oxley compliance framework specifically integrated into Daniels & Company's corporate charter, any hard-stop audit involving the seizure of ongoing forensic investigations requires a mandatory 24-hour notice period to the active CEO, unless there is a sworn affidavit of criminal destruction of evidence. I held Marcus's gaze, my eyes dead and cold. Do you have a sworn affidavit accusing Amelia Daniels of a federal crime, Marcus? Because if you do not, you and your rented suits are currently trespassing in an active executive workspace, violating federal compliance protocols. The lead auditor paused, glancing nervously at Marcus. He was a professional, and he knew a legal trap when he saw one. Mr. Vance assured us the mandate was fully compliant. Mr. Vance lied to you, I said smoothly. I stepped forward, closing the distance to the auditor. I am the lead forensic investigator for this firm. I am currently compiling a report on a multi-million-dollar capital outflow anomaly. If you touch my machine, you are interfering with a protected internal investigation, and I will personally ensure your firm is named in the subsequent SEC obstruction filing. The auditor took a literal step back, lowering the document. Marcus's face flushed dark red. This is a stalling tactic, he hissed. You have nothing, Gray. You're just buying time. I am enforcing the company charter, I corrected him. I looked at my watch. It is currently 7:15 a.m. You have delivered your notice. Your 24-hour waiting period begins now. I suggest you wait in the lobby until tomorrow morning. Marcus glared at me, his fists clenching at his sides. He looked at Amelia, who was standing now, my jacket still wrapped around her like armor. She hadn't said a word, letting me wield my specific competence as a shield. Tomorrow morning, Amelia, Marcus said, his voice dropping the pretense of politeness. The board meets at 9 a.m. Enjoy your last day in your father's office. He turned and walked out, the three auditors trailing quickly behind him like chastised dogs. The heavy glass doors swung shut, plunging the room back into silence. Amelia exhaled a long, shaky breath, her hands dropping from my lapels. He locked us out of the network? She asked, her voice tight. I walked over to my laptop and tapped the spacebar. The screen woke up, displaying a glaring red "Access Denied" banner across the corporate intranet portal. Yes, I said. He severed the primary connection. He's terrified we found the Swift logs. Amelia walked over to the window, the morning sun casting long, harsh shadows across her face. 24 hours, she murmured. We have 24 hours until the board votes, and we can't access the servers to finish the trace. She let out a dry, bitter laugh, a sound that cracked in the middle. He won. He actually did it. My father built this company from a single warehouse in the South Side, and Marcus is going to liquidate it to cover a bad debt play. I stood behind her, watching the defeat settle into her posture. My inner wound, a deep structural distrust of corporate loyalty, flared up. In my experience, when the pressure reached this critical mass, people folded. They took the golden parachute, signed the non-disclosure agreement, and walked away. I waited for her to ask me to draft a severance negotiation. I waited for her to choose the easy exit. Instead, she turned to me, her eyes bright with unshed tears, but her jaw set like granite. Daniel, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I don't know how to stop. I don't know who I am if I'm not fighting for this building. It was a profound moment of vulnerability. The armor was gone. She wasn't the CEO demanding a solution. She was a woman admitting her absolute fear of the void. I didn't step closer to comfort her. I didn't offer physical reassurance. I offered stability. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a thick black external hard drive. I set it on the mahogany table with a heavy, definitive thud. Amelia looked at the drive, then up at me, confusion knitting her brow. I am a forensic accountant, Amelia, I said, my voice steady, grounding her panic in cold reality. I do not trust corporate networks. At 1 a.m., before I ran the final batch script, I mirrored the entire Swift transaction database and the escrow ledger to this encrypted offline drive. Marcus locked us out of an empty house. I have all the data we need, right here. Her eyes widened, the realization washing over her. The despair vanished, replaced by a sudden, fierce spark of hope. She looked at the hard drive, then back at me. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The shift in her posture, the straightening of her spine, was all the acknowledgement I needed. My competence was the mechanism that kept her safe. The problem, I continued, sitting down and plugging the drive into an isolated USB port on my machine, is that the data is raw. It requires manual decryption and cross-verification. Millions of lines of code. It will take approximately 18 hours of uninterrupted, granular analysis to rebuild the routing sequence and link the Delaware LLCs directly to Marcus's personal signature authorization. Amelia walked over to the table and sat down beside me, pulling her own laptop closer, even though it was disconnected from the network. "Show me the decryption sequence," she said, her voice entirely steady. "I can run the secondary verification on the escrow deposits while you build the primary chain." "It is highly technical, tedious work," I warned her, pulling up a black command terminal window. "I learn fast," she replied, rolling up the sleeves of my oversized jacket. "We have 24 hours. Let's dismantle him." The next 18 hours were a masterclass in endurance. We moved the operation from the freezing boardroom to my smaller interior office, which held residual heat. I locked the door, creating a physical boundary against the outside world. The space became a hyper-focused bunker. The air smelled of bitter espresso and the ozone tang of overworked processors. We didn't speak about the hostile takeover. We spoke in numbers, hex codes, and timestamps. I watched her adapt to the brutal rhythm of forensic analysis. When she hit a wall, frustrated by an encrypted string, she didn't complain. She simply tapped the desk twice, a silent request for assistance. I would lean over, my shoulder hovering inches from hers, and type the override command, my focus entirely on the screen, refusing to let the proximity compromise my discipline. I demonstrated top-tier craft with precision, stripping away the obfuscation Marcus had built, layer by layer. By midnight, the physical toll was unavoidable. My eyes felt like they were full of sand, and a dull, throbbing headache had settled at the base of my skull. I noticed Amelia's hands trembling slightly as she typed, a clear sign of low blood sugar and exhaustion. I stopped typing. "Take a break," I said. "I'm fine. I just found the Q2 transfer manifest," she replied, not looking away from the screen. I reached out and gently closed the lid of her laptop. It was a repetition of the boundary I had set the night before, a consistent enforcement of the timeout zone. "You are running a 10% error rate on your last 3 verifications," I stated calmly, relying on facts, not emotion. "You are tired. You are making mistakes. Rest for 20 minutes. She glared at me, the fierce independence fighting the undeniable fatigue. "Daniel, we are too close. If I stop now—" "If you stop now, the world will not end," I interrupted smoothly. I stood up, walked to my mini fridge, and pulled out a protein bar and a bottle of water. I placed them precisely in front of her. "Eat. Breathe. I will finish tracing the manifest. That is my job. Let me do my job." It was the core dynamic of our partnership. I didn't rescue her from her responsibilities. I forced her to acknowledge her own human limits, providing a safe landing space when the altitude got too high. She stared at the protein bar, then slowly picked it up. She didn't argue further. She ate in silence, watching my hands fly across the keyboard as I executed the final data merge. At 4:15 a.m., the terminal window stopped scrolling. A single, distinct document compiled on my screen. It was a digital PDF of the escrow authorization form. At the bottom, clear as day, was the digital signature of Marcus Vance, authorizing the transfer of $7 million into the blind LLC he secretly controlled. The silence in the office was deafening. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I simply hit the print command. The laser printer in the corner whirred to life, spitting out 3 crisp, warm pages. I picked them up, stapled them with mechanical precision, and placed the packet on the desk between us. "The chain of custody is established," I said, my voice completely devoid of inflection. "The fraud is documented. We have the proof." Amelia stared at the packet. She reached out, her fingers brushing the paper, tracing the ink of Marcus's signature. She looked up at me, the reflection of the desk lamp catching the moisture in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "We did it," I corrected her, maintaining the factual reality of the night. "The board meeting is in 4 hours. Try to sleep. I will organize the exhibits." The climax arrived in the vast, glass-walled executive conference room at 9 a.m. sharp. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. 12 board members sat around the polished oval table, their expressions grim. Marcus Vance stood at the head of the room, looking rested, sharp, and victorious. He had a stack of liquidation contracts sitting in front of him, ready for signature. Amelia and I entered the room precisely at 9:01 a.m. We walked in side by side, a united, impenetrable front. She had changed into a sharp navy blue power suit she kept in her office closet. My jacket was gone, but the grounded stillness it had provided her remained evident in every step she took. I carried a single slim leather portfolio. "Amelia," the board chairman, an older man named Harrison, said with a heavy sigh, "this is a difficult morning. Marcus has presented us with the preliminary findings of the external audit. The Q3 losses are unsustainable. We are prepared to vote on the liquidation restructuring." Marcus offered a sympathetic, entirely fake smile. "It's for the best, Amelia. The market shifted. The logistics division simply hemorrhaged capital. We have to stop the bleeding." Amelia didn't sit down. She walked to the center of the table, commanding the room with absolute authority. She didn't raise her voice. She let the silence stretch until every eye was fixed on her. "The logistics division did not hemorrhage capital, Marcus," she said, her voice ringing clear and cold in the large room. "The capital was stolen." A murmur rippled through the board members. Marcus's fake smile vanished, replaced by a tight, angry line. "Amelia, this is desperate. The external auditors locked the system. You have no data. Stop embarrassing yourself." Amelia didn't look at him. She looked at me. It was the signal. I stepped forward, opening the leather portfolio. I didn't make a speech. I relied on the brutal, undeniable weight of measurable reality. I extracted 12 copies of the stapled packet I had printed at 4:15 a.m. I walked around the table, placing a copy precisely in front of each board member, saving the chairman for last. Finally, I placed the last copy directly on top of Marcus's stack of liquidation contracts. "Exhibit A," I stated, my voice cutting through the rising murmurs like a scalpel. "The comprehensive forensic trace of $7 million routed from the logistics division escrow account through a SWIFT transfer protocol into 3 Delaware-registered LLCs." Harrison adjusted his glasses, staring at the paper. "What does this prove, Mr. Gray? Companies use LLCs for risk mitigation constantly." "Turn to page 3, Mr. Chairman," I instructed smoothly. I watched as 12 pages turned simultaneously. Exhibit B, the authorization signature for the escrow release, cross-referenced with the registered ownership matrix of the receiving LLCs. I paused, letting the silence stretch for exactly 3 seconds to maximize the impact. The LLCs are wholly owned by Marcus Vance. The Q3 losses were not operational failures. They were a direct, fraudulent embezzlement orchestrated by your VP of Acquisitions to artificially devalue the company stock and force a hostile buyout at pennies on the dollar. The room erupted. 3 board members stood up, shouting. Harrison slammed his hand on the table, his face purple with rage, staring directly at Marcus. Marcus was pale, his eyes darting frantically around the room. The trap had snapped shut, but not on Amelia. "This is fabricated," he yelled, his composure shattering entirely. "They were locked out of the network. The auditors locked out the live network at 7 a.m. yesterday," I interrupted, my tone perfectly calm, dominating the chaos without raising my volume. I secured a legally subpoenaed encrypted mirror of the transaction logs at 1 a.m. The chain of custody is pristine, documented, and currently resting on a secure server at an independent legal firm, ready for the SEC and the FBI. I looked directly at Marcus, delivering the final blow. "You didn't find a loophole, Marcus. You left a trail. And I am very good at following trails." Amelia stepped forward, placing both hands flat on the table, leaning in. She looked at the stack of liquidation contracts in front of Marcus. With one swift, decisive motion, she grabbed the stack, ripped the contracts in half, and dropped the scrapped paper onto the polished wood. "The buyout is canceled," Amelia declared, her voice carrying the absolute power of a woman who had just reclaimed her kingdom. "Harrison, I expect a motion to terminate Marcus Vance for cause, effective immediately, pending criminal prosecution." Harrison didn't hesitate. "Motion granted. Security will escort Mr. Vance from the building." The aftermath was a blur of rapid-fire corporate triage. Lawyers were called, statements were drafted, and the external auditors were unceremoniously dismissed. By 2 p.m., Marcus Vance was gone, his office locked, his career annihilated. The adrenaline crash hit the executive floor like a physical weight, leaving a quiet, exhausted calm in its wake. I was packing my laptop into my briefcase in my office when Amelia walked in. The power suit remained, but the rigid tension in her shoulders had finally dissolved. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me organize my cables with meticulous precision. We had survived the war, and now the heavy, unspoken reality of our partnership hung in the air. "The board approved a full internal sweep," she said quietly. "They want you to lead the forensic team to ensure Marcus didn't leave any other traps." "I'll draft the project scope by Monday," I replied, clicking my briefcase shut. I picked it up, turning to face her. "You should go home, Amelia. The crisis is contained. You need to sleep in a real bed." She didn't move from the doorway. She looked at me, her gaze steady and searching. "You saved my father's company, Daniel. You saved me." I shook my head slightly, rejecting the savior narrative. "I found the numbers. You stood in that room and executed the strategy. You didn't need saving. You just needed the ammunition." She smiled, a small, genuine expression that reached her eyes. It was a micro-joy, a crack in the corporate armor that she only allowed me to see. She stepped aside, letting me pass through the doorway, but she fell into step beside me as we walked down the quiet hallway toward the elevators. We rode down the 42 floors in comfortable silence. The doors opened to the lobby, and we walked out through the revolving glass doors onto the bustling Chicago street. The afternoon sun was weak, the air still biting with the winter chill. The city moved around us, loud and indifferent, a stark contrast to the intense, isolated bunker we had inhabited for the last 3 days. I turned to her, preparing to offer a standard, professional goodbye. But before I could speak, Amelia reached out. She didn't grab my arm or pull me into a hug. She simply slid her hand down my arm and intertwined her fingers with mine. Her grip was firm, deliberate, and entirely unhesitant. It was a public choice, an active claim made in the middle of a crowded sidewalk. The physical contact acted as an immediate grounding wire. The residual anxiety, the exhaustion, the structural isolation I carried, it all stopped spinning. The transfer of stability was mutual. I looked down at our joined hands, then up at her face. She wasn't looking at the crowd or checking to see who was watching. She was looking squarely at me, her expression conveying a profound, undeniable certainty. I didn't offer a grand romantic speech. I didn't pull her into a desperate kiss. I operated in the realm of practical reality, and in this reality, this woman had just chosen to anchor herself to me. I tightened my grip on her hand, locking the connection in place, a silent seal on a promise of consistent, unwavering support. We stood there for a long moment, the noise of the city fading into the background, shielded entirely by the quiet strength of our shared partnership. I learned that true victory isn't about fighting alone to prove your strength. It's about finding the person you can trust enough to let them carry the shield when your arms are tired. Healthy love isn't about dramatic rescues. It is about consistent safety, shared burdens, and the quiet dignity of a promise kept in the dark. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.